My wife took me to dinner with her Japanese boss, but in truth, he was the man helping her plan to erase me. I sat there with a harmless smile, playing the part of a clueless husband, pretending I didn't understand a single word of Japanese. She gently rubbed her belly, looked at him and said in the language they thought was their perfect shield, "Don't worry, this idiot's completely lost in the fantasy of being a father. He'll spend his whole life raising your son and hand over everything he owns, still believing it's his." I calmly poured them more wine, looked straight at Broderick and said in flawless Japanese, "The wine tonight is excellent, and your conversation is even better. Before we begin, I'm grateful you're here. Drop a comment and tell me what city are you watching from. I read every single one. This story contains fictional elements crafted for storytelling and reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the lessons it carries are ones worth keeping. I have kept secrets my entire adult life. Not the small kind, not the kind you tuck away out of embarrassment or convenience. The kind I kept were structural, load-bearing, the kind that, if removed, would bring down everything built on top of them. My wife of 12 years believed I was a mid-level operations manager at a downtown consulting firm. She knew the office address, knew the name on the door, knew I left every morning at 7:45 and came home smelling like coffee and unremarkable meetings. What she did not know, what no one in my personal life knew, was that the consulting firm was mine, that I had founded it 30 years ago with $11,000 borrowed from my father and a single client I had cold called from a payphone in the lobby of a building I could not afford to rent space in. That what had started in a one-room office on the south side of Chicago had grown over 3 decades of careful, quiet work into Global Nexus, a firm operating across 19 countries, managing international corporate strategy for clients whose names appeared regularly in the Wall Street Journal. The main offices occupied the 47th floor of Willis Tower. On a clear day, you could see 4 states from those windows. Sabrina had never seen that view. It was a Monday morning in early November, and Chicago had already decided that winter was not coming. It had arrived, the kind of cold that finds you before you reach the end of the driveway, that settles into your coat and stays there all day no matter how many layers you wear underneath. I stood at the kitchen window of our Lincoln Park home and watched snow move sideways across the backyard, slow and purposeful, covering everything evenly. Behind me, I could hear Sabrina moving carefully around the kitchen island, the particular slow shuffle of a woman 9 months pregnant, navigating a space that had recently become slightly too small for her. She was 45 years old, and she was glowing in the way people describe, but rarely mean literally. She meant it literally. There was a warmth to her that November mornings could not touch. She handed me a coffee mug without being asked. That was the thing about Sabrina, she had always known what I needed before I said it, or I had believed she did. I was wearing a Land's End jacket I had owned for 6 years, a perfectly ordinary jacket for a perfectly ordinary man. Beneath it, a gray wool sweater, nothing remarkable. Nothing that suggested the man inside it had just the previous Thursday finalized a $43 million contract, restructuring with a logistics company in Stuttgart. My father had come to this country from Guadalajara in 1971 with $40 a single suitcase and a belief so fundamental it had never required examination, that a man who lets the world know what he has will spend the rest of his life protecting it from people who want to take it. He built a small plumbing business in Pilsen, worked it for 35 years, and left it to my younger brother when he retired. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a man no one had ever successfully cheated, and he wore that distinction with more pride than most people wear their fortunes. He taught me 5 languages, Spanish, French, Japanese, German, and Mandarin, not because he spoke them all himself, but because he believed that understanding how people think in their own language gives you something translation cannot. He taught me to dress below my means in rooms where I held the advantage. He taught me that the most dangerous thing a man can reveal is the full extent of what he is capable of. And so, I had kept the secret. Through 12 years of marriage, through dinners and vacations and long Sunday mornings in this kitchen, I had maintained the performance of the ordinary man. I paid myself a modest salary from a subsidiary account, enough to cover our household expenses, enough to seem real. The rest lived in corporate accounts and a private trust that Sabrina had no reason to know existed. It was not deception in the legal sense. We had never combined finances in the way some couples do, and she had never asked questions I would have been required to answer honestly. I told myself I had done it because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had built. That was true, partially true, I believed it completely at the time. My phone buzzed against the counter. I glanced at the screen, Sylvia's name, and beneath it the small French flag emoji she used when calling about European matters. Sylvia Hartwell had been my executive assistant for 11 years. She was 42, impeccably organized, and operated with the kind of institutional knowledge that made her genuinely irreplaceable. She was the only person at Global Nexus who had my personal cell number, and she used it only when something required my attention before I reached the office. I picked up the phone, turned slightly away from Sabrina, and answered in French. The Paris contract, a distribution agreement with a pharmaceutical group in the 8th arrondissement, had hit a snag over indemnity language in the 3rd clause. I listened, gave Sylvia 3 clear instructions in under 90 seconds, confirmed that our Paris counsel should proceed on that basis, and ended the call. When I turned back, Sabrina was watching me with that particular look she had, fond, slightly amused. The expression of a woman who finds something charming about her husband without fully understanding what it is. "Who was that?" she asked. "Just the office," I said, setting the phone face down on the counter. "Nothing important." She nodded, accepting it the way she always accepted it, and went back to the careful business of lowering herself into the kitchen chair. I watched her settle, watched her hand move automatically to rest on the curve of her stomach. A gesture so habitual now, it seemed less like something she did and more like something that simply happened. The way breathing happens. 7 months along when the pregnancy had been announced. 9 months now. 3 weeks from the date the doctors had circled on the calendar. I had spent the better part of this year reading books about fatherhood, about the particular terror and privilege of raising another human being. At 57, I had stopped believing that particular chapter of my life was still available to me. Then it was. Then Sabrina had come to me with tears and a pregnancy test, and the most unexpected gift I had received in decades. I had dared carefully and privately to hope. I poured the rest of my coffee into the sink, picked up my keys from the hook by the door, and reached for my jacket. That was when I saw it. Sabrina's phone lay on the far end of the kitchen counter screen, facing up, lit with a notification. The name displayed was 2 initials BR, and beneath it, a preview of the message that had just arrived tonight, same place. Sabrina crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, quicker than a woman 9 months pregnant should have been able to move, and picked up the phone. She pressed the side button to darken the screen, slid it into her cardigan pocket, and looked up at me with a smile that did not arrive quite fast enough. I was already looking at my keys. "Have a good day," she said. "You too," I said. I walked out into the Chicago cold and told myself it was nothing. A work contact, a scheduling message, 2 initials and 3 words that meant nothing in particular. I told myself that for exactly 3 months. But to understand what I saw on that phone screen, you have to go back 10 months to a January night when the snow fell so heavy it buried the streetlights on Wrightwood Avenue. And my wife was crying in my arms in a way I had not seen since the very beginning of our marriage. The living room was warm. I remember that clearly, the particular warmth of a house that has been sealed against a Chicago winter, the radiators working overtime, the windows fogged at the edges. Sabrina had come home from a doctor's appointment that afternoon and had not said much at dinner. I had not pushed. In 12 years I had learned that she came to difficult things in her own time. She came to it that night, sitting across from me on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, the way they folded when she was trying to hold something together. The diagnosis, she said, was blocked fallopian tubes, a condition her gynecologist had discovered during a routine examination. One that would make natural conception effectively impossible. She had known something was wrong for a few weeks. She had waited to tell me until she was certain. I listened without speaking. That was the only thing I knew how to do in that moment. What I did not tell her, what I had never told anyone in any detail, was why her words landed the way they did. 10 years earlier, Sabrina and I had lost a son. His name was Daniel. He was 7 months old when his heart stopped, during what the doctors called a routine procedure, a corrective surgery for a defect they had assured us was minor and manageable. He had been small and loud and furious about everything the way healthy babies are, and then he was not there anymore. The way grief works after something like that is not the way people describe it from the outside. It does not diminish over time so much as it relocates. It moves from the front of every day to somewhere deeper and quieter. Somewhere you learn to live around without ever quite forgetting it is there. After Daniel, I had stopped allowing myself to want that again. It was not a conscious decision. It was more like a door that closes slowly over years, until one morning you realize it has been shut for a long time, and you are no longer sure you remember how to open it. Sabrina was crying now, in the way that particular kind of hope cries, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The loss of a possibility, the closing of a door she had believed was still open. "I just want to give us a family Conrad," she said. "A real one, while we still can." I put my arm around her and said nothing for a while. Outside, the snow kept coming. There is a version of this story where I asked more questions, where I slowed down and thought carefully about timing and motivation and the particular convenience of this conversation, arriving at this moment in our lives. I am a man who has spent 30 years making decisions that other people's livelihoods depended on. I know how to slow down. I know how to ask the questions that matter. But grief has a way of finding the gap in every armor, no matter how carefully constructed. And the gap in mine had always had Daniel's name on it. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Yeah, I glanced at the screen. Preston. Preston was my son from my first marriage, which had ended quietly and without particular rancor when he was 4 years old. He was 28 now. In his final year at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, one of the top law programs in the country, and he had grown into a young man who wore his intelligence visibly, the way some people wear expensive clothes. He was attentive, well-spoken, and had always made a point of staying close to both his parents in the way that adult children do when they have been raised to understand that effort is a form of love. I answered, "Dad." He said without preamble, "I know Mom just got home from the doctor. She called me earlier." A pause, the considered pause of a young man who has learned to let silences do work. "I did some research this afternoon. Doctor Whitfield at the Whitfield Fertility Center on North Michigan Avenue, he's considered the best reproductive endocrinologist in Illinois. I've already sent an inquiry to his office on your behalf. I hope that's okay." I looked at Sabrina, who was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand and watching me with an expression that was equal parts hope and apology. "That's okay," I said. "Thank you, Preston." 3 weeks later, I sat in a consultation room at the Whitfield Fertility Center, clean lines, soft lighting. The particular hushed quality of medical offices that specialize in things people want very badly. Dr. Whitfield was 52 years old, with gray at his temples and the unhurried manner of a man who understood that his patients arrived carrying weight he could not fully see. He explained the IVF process clearly and without condescension. He answered every question I asked. He seemed in every observable way to be exactly what Preston had described. The consent forms were straightforward. My contribution to the process, a sperm sample provided, that same afternoon in a clinical room down the hall would be processed, combined with Sabrina's retrieved eggs under controlled laboratory conditions, and the resulting embryo transferred to Sabrina's uterus within a designated window. Standard procedure. Thousands of couples went through it every year in this country. There was nothing unusual about any of it. I signed the forms. I shook Dr. Whitfield's hand across his desk and looked him in the eye the way my father had taught me to look people in the eye directly long enough to mean something. I remember thinking on the drive home that afternoon that sometimes life offers you a second chance if you are brave enough to take it without asking too many questions. I had taken it. I had felt something close to gratitude shaking that man's hand, gratitude for the science, for the possibility, for the fact that a door I had believed was permanently shut had turned out to have another way in. I would spend a considerable amount of time later thinking about that handshake, about what I had chosen to see in it and what I had chosen not to. I had parked the car at the curb and waited for Sabrina to finish her follow-up consultation inside, through the plate glass window of the clinic's front office. I could see her standing near the reception desk, not sitting the way patients sit when they are waiting, but standing close to Dr. Whitfield, her voice low. Her posture easy in a way that people's posture is easy when they are comfortable with the person they are speaking to. Whitfield nodded once. Then Sabrina turned and walked toward the exit. I looked down at my phone. I almost asked her about it on the drive home. I had the question formed and ready, casual, curious. The kind of question a husband asks because he is interested rather than suspicious. I held it in my mouth for the length of 3 traffic lights and then let it go. It was probably nothing. A last-minute instruction about medication, timing, a question about the follow-up schedule. These things happen in medical offices. People stand close and speak quietly because the subject matter calls for it. I let it go. That was the second mistake I made that January. The first had been believing without sufficient evidence that everyone in that consultation room wanted the same thing I did. 5 months passed. The IVF had worked, or so we were told. Sabrina announced the pregnancy in March with champagne and tears and a joy I had absolutely no reason to question. I spent those months doing what expectant fathers do when they have spent a long time not allowing themselves to hope. I read everything I could find. I researched elementary schools in Lincoln Park. I spent an afternoon measuring the spare bedroom and another afternoon in a furniture store on North Clybourne Avenue, running my hand along the rails of cribs I had no business looking at yet, but could not quite stop myself from touching. Then June arrived, and with it a phone that was not mine. Preston had stopped by the house that evening on his way back from a study session at Northwestern's downtown campus, a habit he had maintained since Sabrina's pregnancy was announced. These informal check-ins that I had read as the attentiveness of a young man stepping into a larger version of himself. He stayed for 40 minutes. We sat in the kitchen and talked about a securities fraud case his clinic was working on, the kind of case that third-year law students argue about with the particular intensity of people who have not yet had to argue them in front of actual judges. He was sharp. He had always been sharp. I had been proud of that. He left in a hurry, his phone rang as he was pulling on his jacket, and he was out the door with a half-finished goodbye. The way young people leave when the call feels more urgent than the room they are already in. I went back to my study. I had a contract review that needed to finish before morning, a restructuring agreement with a logistics partner in Frankfurt that Sylvia had flagged as requiring my personal attention. I sat down at my desk, put on my reading glasses, and worked. An hour later, a phone buzzed on the corner of my desk. Not my phone. Preston's a second handset, a prepaid model with a plain black case that he had left behind in his rush to leave. I reached over to silence it without thinking, and the screen lit up with the impact of my touch. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision matters. I did not unlock the phone. I did not enter a passcode or attempt to access any application. The message had arrived while the screen was dark and when I touched the device. The screen simply illuminated the way any smartphone screen illuminates when it receives a notification, and the preview of the message was visible in full on the lock screen, the way message previews are visible by default on most devices. I did not have to do anything to read it. It was simply there. The sender's name was BR. The same initials I had seen on Sabrina's phone 7 months earlier on a November morning. I had spent all of winter and spring convincing myself meant nothing. The message read, "Good. Keep me posted. The old man has no idea, does he?" And beneath it, Preston's response sent 4 minutes before I had picked up the phone. None whatsoever. He's completely bought in. Honestly, it's almost sad how badly he wants this. You're more of a father to me than he's ever been. Everything is on schedule. I set the phone down in the exact spot where it had been sitting. I did not move it. I did not move. Outside the study window, Chicago was wet and restless under a June rain, the kind of rain that falls in this city in early summer, like it has somewhere to be, fast and purposeful, lighting up the street below in brief silver flashes. I watched it for a while. I am not sure how long. There is a specific quality to pain that arrives without warning in a quiet room. It does not announce itself. It does not give you a moment to brace. It simply occupies the space where something else used to be, and you sit with it because there is nothing else to do. I had built a company across 19 countries by understanding at a fundamental level how people think. I had spent 3 decades reading rooms, reading contracts, reading the silences between what people said and what they meant. I had been wrong about individuals before that was inevitable in any life lived at scale. But I had never been wrong about my own son. I stood up, walked to the side table where I kept a bottle of Macallan and poured 2 fingers into a glass. Then I sat back down and looked at the photograph on the bookshelf, the one taken last summer in the backyard, all 3 of us squinting into the afternoon light. Sabrina on the left, her hand on Preston's arm. Preston in the middle, one hand around his mother's shoulder, one hand around mine, smiling, all 3 of us smiling. I thought about my father. About the man who had crossed a border with $40 and built something real through 30 years of silence and patience and the disciplined refusal to show his hand before he was ready. He had taught me that the most important thing a man can do when the ground shifts beneath him is not to react. It is to understand completely and without illusion exactly what has shifted and why before he takes a single step in any direction. I thought about what he would do right now in this chair with this glass and this photograph and these 2 sentences on a stranger's phone. I already knew the answer. I picked up my own phone and called the only person who had known me longer than the lie had existed. Edmund Hale had been my closest friend since we were 23 years old. Two broke kids sharing a sublet in Wicker Park, arguing about everything and agreeing about the things that mattered. He was 56 now, ran a small architecture firm in River North, and was the single human being on Earth who knew both the full version of what I had built and the full version of what I had chosen to hide. He picked up after 2 rings. "Edmund," I said, "I need to talk to you, not tomorrow, now." There was a pause, the kind that Edmund allowed when he was measuring something. "How deep do you want to look, Conrad?" His voice was even. He had always been even. Because some things, once you see them, you can't unsee. I looked at the photograph on the shelf, at Preston's hand on my shoulder, at the smile I had believed without examination was real. "All the way," I said. The next morning I did something I had not done in 12 years of marriage. I went to work as myself. I want to be clear about what that means, because the distinction matters. I had been going to Willis Tower every weekday for years. That part was not a lie. What was a lie? Or something close enough to, it was the version of myself I had chosen to be once I got there. On most mornings I entered through a side lobby, took a private elevator, and moved through the building in the way that a man moves through a space he owns, but does not want people to know he owns. I had a cover story for the staff, on floors I occasionally visited. A business card with a title that was technically accurate and completely misleading. It was an architecture of omission that had taken years to build and required almost no maintenance. Because most people do not ask questions about the quiet man who always seems to belong wherever he is standing. That Tuesday morning in early July, I walked through the main entrance on South Wacker Drive, nodded to the security desk by name, and took the express elevator to the 47th floor. I did not explain myself to anyone. I did not have to. The floor belonged to Global Nexus. When the elevator doors opened, Sylvia Hartwell was already at her station, a curved desk positioned to face both the elevator bank and the glass-walled corridor that ran the length of the floor. She was 42 years old, wore her dark hair pulled back in the way she always did when she expected a heavy workday, and had the particular stillness of someone who has learned to read a room before the first word is spoken. She had worked for me for 11 years. She knew, from the angle at which I stepped off that elevator, that something had shifted. She handed me a briefing folder without a word. The morning moved the way my mornings at Willis Tower always moved, with a velocity that bore no resemblance to the measured pace of the household on Wrightwood Avenue. The Frankfurt contract required a 30-minute call in German with the legal team at our logistics partner. A structural disagreement about liability caps that I resolved before the coffee in my hand went cold. Then Seoul, a 40-minute conversation with the principals. Of a supply chain firm we were evaluating for acquisition, conducted through our in-house interpreter, the kind of call where even the pauses carry meaning. Then, London late afternoon, their time. A British litigation team handling a wrongful termination, claim filed by a former contractor, English, but a different register entirely. The particular cadence of Lincoln's Inn lawyers who have been arguing cases since before I was born. 3 calls, 3 languages, 1 morning. I mention this not to impress, but to explain something that will matter. Later in this story, I had spent my entire adult life inhabiting multiple versions of myself simultaneously, and I had become very good at it. Too good, perhaps. Good enough that I had convinced myself the performance was sustainable indefinitely. After London, I asked Sylvia to clear the next 30 minutes and told her to send in Rafferty. Owen Rafferty was 51 years old, broad-shouldered with the deliberate physical economy of a man who had spent years in situations where unnecessary movement attracted attention. He had spent 14 years as a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Chicago before retiring at 45 and setting up a private investigative firm fully licensed by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, which is the relevant authority for that work in this state. He had been doing contracted work for Global Nexus for the past 15 years, the kind of work that companies of our size quietly require and rarely discuss: background investigations, due diligence on potential partners, the occasional domestic matter when a senior executive's personal situation required careful legal and confidential handling. He sat down across from my desk without being asked and opened a small notebook. I told him what I knew, not what I suspected what I knew. The message on Preston's phone, the initials BR, the pattern of behavior I had been cataloging, without quite admitting I was cataloging it since the previous November. I told him about the IVF, about the phlebotomy clinic, about the name Whitfield. I told him about Broderick Reeves, though at that point I knew only the initials and what Preston's message implied. I told him I needed everything, not impressions, not inferences, documentation. Financial records were accessible through legal channels, public filings court, records, property records, business registrations, surveillance of movements and associations conducted within the bounds of Illinois law. A complete picture, assembled from sources that would hold up if they were ever examined by anyone else. He wrote without looking up. When I finished, he asked the question I had been expecting. "How far do you want me to go?" I turned toward the window. On a clear July morning, Chicago spreads out below the 47th floor like something that does not quite believe in its own size, the lake flat and almost colorless to the east. The grid of streets running south until they disappear, the river catching light in small pieces far below. I had looked at that view for 30 years. I had never grown tired of it. "That's far enough to understand exactly what I'm dealing with," I said. "And Rafferty, I need you thorough, not fast, thorough. Take whatever time it requires." He nodded once and closed the notebook. That evening I drove home along Lakeshore Drive through the last of the summer light, parked in the garage on Wrightwood, and walked through the back door into the kitchen where Sabrina was finishing dinner. She was 6 months along, by then moving with the particular careful deliberateness of late pregnancy. And she looked up when I came in with the expression she always had, fond, uncomplicated, the face of a woman who believed she knew exactly who was walking through her door. I asked her what she wanted to eat. I asked whether the baby had been active today. I sat beside her on the couch after dinner and felt the movement beneath my palm when she placed my hand against her stomach. And I made the sound a man makes when he feels that for the first time, or what was supposed to be the first time. And she smiled at me, and I smiled back. The performance had always been hers. Now it was mine too. The difference was that I knew I was performing. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening in late July, my phone rang while Sabrina and I were halfway through dinner. I recognized Rafferty's number. I apologized, said it was the office, and stepped out to the back porch. The night was warm, cicadas somewhere in the dark. "A Conrad Meyer," Rafferty said, with the tone he used when the news was significant, and he wanted to be certain I was paying attention before he gave it. "Broderick Reeves is not just involved with your wife. For the past 2 years, he's been running money through shell companies incorporated in Osaka. The transactions are structured to avoid triggering domestic reporting thresholds, amounts kept just under $10,000, cycled through multiple entities before reaching U.S. accounts. Your son Preston has been handling the legal documentation for at least 3 of those entities. We have the incorporation filings." I looked through the kitchen window. Sabrina was at the table, one hand resting on her stomach, the other holding her phone. Her face turned slightly away from me. She looked peaceful. She looked exactly like the woman I had married. "How solid is it?" I asked. "Solid enough to end careers," Rafferty said, "and marriages." I stood on the porch for another moment after the call ended, listening to the cicadas, watching my wife through the glass. Then I went back inside and finished dinner. Before I show you the full blueprint of what was planned against Conrad, comment, "Keep going," so I know you're still watching. A quick note. Some elements of this story are fictional, crafted for depth and impact. If that's not for you, no pressure, but if you're staying, what's coming next will stay with you. It was the kind of morning Chicago reserves for moments it wants you to remember. The sky above the lake was still dark at 5:47 a.m., and the city lights below the 47th floor spread out like a circuit board that hadn't decided yet whether to switch on. I had arrived before Sylvia, before the cleaning crew, before anyone. I made my own coffee using the small machine in the corner of my private office, the one Sylvia kept stocked, but rarely. Touched herself, and I set the manila folder Rafferty had left at my door the night before flat on the center of my desk. I did not open it immediately. I sat down. I looked at it. I drank half my coffee. Then I opened it. The first page was a summary sheet. Rafferty had always known how I read conclusions. First evidence, second narrative last. At the top in his clean block lettering were 3 words. Phase 1 IVF. Whitfield Fertility Center on North Michigan Avenue had received 2 wire transfers in the months preceding Sabrina's procedure. The first, for $30,000, came from a Delaware-registered LLC called Green Lawn Advisory Partners. The second, also $30,000, arrived 6 weeks later from a different source, a personal account held jointly by Preston, and an entity Rafferty had flagged simply as BR Holdings. $60,000 in total. Paid to doctor. Whitfield before a single embryo had been transferred. I turned the page. The laboratory protocol at Whitfield showed a standard entry for my sample collected on January 23rd. But a secondary internal log, one that should never have left the clinic server, and that Rafferty had, obtained through a source I would not ask him to name in writing, showed a second entry 6 hours later. Same date, same patient file, different sample ID. My sample had been discarded. The embryo Sabrina was now carrying had never been mine. I put the page face down on the desk. I picked up my coffee. I finished it. Then I turned the page back over and kept reading, because that is what you do when there is no point in stopping. Phase 2. Divorce began on the next tab, separated by a red divider. Preston, still a student at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, had access to faculty resources and senior clinic partners through an externship program. What he had done with that access was not academic. Over a period of 4 months, February through May of 2024, he had been constructing a case file. The file was designed to be presented to an Illinois family court as evidence of a pattern of mental abuse and marital infidelity on my part. The abuse allegations were fabricated. Rafferty had traced their origin to 3 affidavits, 2 from individuals who had never been to our home, and 1 from a neighbor who had since moved to Scottsdale, and according to cell records, received 2 calls from Preston the week before signing. The infidelity evidence was a collection of photographs and hotel receipts. The hotel, a property I had used for 4 private business dinners over 18 months, had been framed to suggest overnight stays I had never made. The receipts had been altered. Room numbers had been changed. Dates had been shifted by a day in either direction. It was patient work, careful work, the kind that takes months, not weeks. The outcome Preston had planned for was straightforward. After the baby arrived, which Sabrina had registered as due in mid-December, she would file for divorce and immediately petition for primary custody. With the fabricated evidence, and with Preston acting as her legal advisor behind the scenes, the divorce court would find in her favor. I would lose the Lincoln Park house. I would lose access to the joint accounts, which held enough to finance the early stages of whatever came next. And I would be ordered to pay child support, ongoing and forcible court-mandated, for a child whose DNA I did not carry. I held that page for a long time. Not because of the money. The money was not the point. The point was the child. Whoever that child turned out to be, I had agreed to be that child's father. I had signed consent forms. I had allowed myself to hope, which I had not done since Daniel, and someone had looked directly at that hope and decided to use it. Phase 3. Commitment was the title Rafferty had given the final section. It was his dry way of saying something worse. Dr. Harmon, I had never met the man. His name had not come up in any of the earlier conversations, but he was in the file now 2 full pages. Dr. Leonard Harmon, licensed psychiatrist, had received a payment of $45,000 from BR Holdings in April 2024. In exchange, he had agreed to produce a clinical evaluation declaring me mentally unfit, specifically exhibiting signs of delusional ideation and erratic financial decision-making. The report had not yet been filed. It was being held ready to deploy at the moment I began to resist the divorce proceedings. The purpose was not to hospitalize me. The purpose was to disqualify me legally. A man declared mentally unfit by a licensed psychiatrist in Illinois cannot effectively contest asset division, custody arrangements, or court orders without a guardian ad litem assigned to oversee his interests. By the time any counter-argument could be mounted, the divorce would be finalized. I placed my hand flat on the desk, not a fist. Just a hand palm down, fingers spread pressing gently against the wood, as if checking whether the surface was real. They had not come for my money. Anyone sophisticated enough to build this over 18 months could have simply demanded a divorce and walked away with half of what the courts would see a mid-level operations manager's modest assets. They had come for everything, the money, yes, but also my voice, my credibility, my ability to stand in a room and be taken seriously. Phase 3 existed for one reason: to make sure that when I finally understood what had been done to me, I would have no mechanism left to fight back. It was, I had to admit, a very good plan. My phone rang. Rafferty. I picked up on the first ring. "You read it?" he asked. "All of it." A pause. Then, "There's one more thing. I was going to include it in the file, but I thought you should hear it first." His voice had changed, careful now. The way it got when the information was not just serious, but genuinely unexpected. I ran the DNA timeline, based on the embryo transfer date, the estimated conception window, And Broderick Reeves's medical records from a private clinic in Zurich records that took 2 weeks to obtain. Broderick Reeves is clinically infertile, has been for at least 4 years. I said nothing. Conrad, Rafferty's voice was flat and precise. He cannot be the father of that child, which means someone else's. Outside, the sun had finally begun to rise over Lake Michigan, turning the water the color of old copper. I watched it for a moment. That light. That slow and indifferent light, and I thought about what it means to build something carefully over decades, and what it means to find out that the people closest to you have been building something else entirely, using materials they borrowed from your life without asking. Find out who. I said. I asked Rafferty to explain. He didn't rush it. Rafferty never rushed anything that mattered. He closed the folder in front of him, adjusted his glasses slightly, not because they needed adjusting, but because he always did that before saying something precise, and then he began. 40 minutes. That was how long it took. 40 minutes of carefully structured facts, timelines, documents, and silence placed exactly where it needed to be. By the time he finished, I understood something about my wife that 12 years of marriage had never revealed to me. Her capacity for deception had never been limited to one person. She hadn't been lying to me. She had been running 2 entirely separate constructions of reality at the same time, and both of them had been stable. I was one of them. Broderick Reeves was the other. Rafferty had started where he always started, with what couldn't lie. Medical records. Broderick Reeves had been diagnosed with azoospermia in the spring of 2021. Not a temporary condition, not a probability, a certainty, a complete absence of viable sperm. The diagnosis had been confirmed twice 6 months apart at a private urology practice affiliated with Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The documentation was clean, consistent, and medically unambiguous. There was no path to biological fatherhood, not without donor material. Rafferty didn't need to emphasize that part. He simply let it sit there. Broderick knew. That wasn't speculation, that wasn't theory, that was fact. What came next had taken Rafferty longer to obtain. He didn't explain how. He never did when it involved sources that preferred not to be named. But he laid it out in front of me anyway, a chain of emails. September through November of 2023, between Sabrina and Broderick. I remember the date when he pointed to it, October 14th, a Tuesday. I remember because I had been in Frankfurt that week, renegotiating terms with our German logistics partner. Long days, structured meetings, predictable conversations. While that had been happening, somewhere else, something else had already been set in motion. Broderick had written to her directly. No hesitation, no implication. Plain language. He told her about the diagnosis, told her it had been confirmed, used the word permanent. Rafferty didn't need to read it out loud. He just handed me the printed copy. Sabrina's reply had arrived 11 minutes later. 11 minutes. That was all it had taken her to decide what reality would look like from that point forward. She wrote, "That doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything between us. We'll figure it out." I read the sentence once, then again. Then I place the paper face down on the desk, as if turning it over would somehow reduce the weight of what it represented. They exchanged 7 more emails over the following 3 weeks. The topic never came up again, not once. Whatever figuring it out had meant to Sabrina, she had already resolved it, privately, completely, and without ever explaining how. Broderick, Rafferty said, likely filled in the blanks himself. Men like him don't ask questions when the answer they want is already available to believe. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything to respond to. Rafferty moved on. He walked me through the timeline next. Precise, measured, unemotional. The embryo transfer at Whitfield had taken place on January 28, 2024. The estimated window of conception based on standard IVF protocol, cross-referenced with a secondary log, Rafferty had obtained aligned perfectly with the final week of January, which meant one thing. Whatever genetic material had been used to create that embryo had been collected no earlier than mid-January and no later than the 28th. There was no ambiguity there, no overlap, no room for interpretation. It was not mine. We had already established that earlier. Task 5. A clinical confirmation delivered without ceremony. It was not Broderick's. That had been established years before any of us were even involved. Biology had settled that long ago, which left a third source. Rafferty didn't say it immediately. Instead, he reached for a separate folder, thinner than the first, more precise, more deliberate. He had traced Sabrina's movements backward, Not broadly, not vaguely, specifically, her social calendar, her phone's location data, cross-referenced against known events, patterns, timestamps. On the evening of December 14th, 2023, a Friday. I remember that night. I had been at the Lincoln Park house, reading contracts, waiting for her to come home. She had attended a company holiday party, hosted by a financial consulting group. Location, the Ivory Room, River North. I knew the place. Dark interior, high ceilings, white tablecloths, private dining spaces designed for conversations that didn't want witnesses. The kind of place where staff were trained not to exist. Invisible, efficient, unnoticed. One of those staff members, a 29-year-old man named Remy Callahan. Rafferty showed me his file before anything else. Employment history, shift logs, a background check, clean, completely clean, no criminal record, no connections. No patterns that suggested anything beyond an ordinary life lived with consistency. Then he showed me the photograph. Standard ID, the kind clipped to a personnel file. Nothing staged, nothing curated. The young man in it had an open face, unstructured, unpracticed. The kind of face that hadn't yet learned how to hide itself. His hands were partially visible at the edge of the frame, rough, textured, hands that had worked. Hands that belonged to someone who had built his life one shift at a time. He had been waiting tables since he was 19, supporting a younger sister through community college. That detail stayed with me longer than it should have. There was nothing extraordinary about him, nothing strategic, nothing intentional. He had simply been working a Friday night shift. And somehow, without knowing it, he had been placed at the center of something he had never chosen. I kept my eyes on the photograph for a long moment. Rafferty said nothing. He understood silence, understood when information required space to settle. I thought about what Remy Callahan knew, and more importantly, what he didn't. As far as Rafferty had been able to determine, he had no knowledge of any of it. Not the IVF, not the embryo, not the child that would be born months later carrying his DNA, in a city that would never notice. He had gone to work, finished his shift, gone home, and everything that followed had been built around him without his participation, without his consent. In a situation defined entirely by deliberate choices, he was the only one who hadn't made any. I said that out loud, quietly, more to myself than to Rafferty. He has no idea. Rafferty confirmed. As of this week, he's still working the same restaurant, different shift now. Picked up a second job at a cafe in Wicker Park. I nodded, slowly. There is a kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name. Not in English, not in any language I know. It's not loss in the traditional sense. Nothing was taken, nothing was removed. It's something else. Something quieter. The loss of something that only existed as expectation, as preparation, as belief in something that had never actually been yours. I had spent 8 months preparing, converting a spare bedroom into a nursery, reading books I would never admit to anyone I had read, memorizing a date. December 15th, the way you memorize something important, something inevitable. The child I had been preparing to love had never belonged to me. There was nothing to grieve in a conventional sense, no ending, no event. And yet the absence had shape, it had weight, and I could feel it sitting there in the room with me, as clearly as the desk in front of me. I set the photograph down, carefully. What about Sabrina and Broderick, I asked. Does he know? Rafferty shook his head. Not from anything we've found. He paused. She's let him believe it's his. He's been sending money, separate account, not tied to Reeves Capital. 11,000 over 4 months. Of course he had. Of course she had. She had told him the child was his. She had told me the child was mine, and the child belonged to neither of us. It was efficient, in a way that only a certain kind of mind can achieve. A single lie, distributed across 2 realities. I was still thinking about that when the door opened. Sylvia. She entered the way she always did, quietly, deliberately. She understood rooms, understood when something had shifted. She carried her tablet at her side, not in front of her. Another signal. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. Her tone told me it mattered. Broderick Reeves has submitted a formal request for an emergency meeting with our investment group, filed an hour ago. She paused. $8 million, bridge financing, 30 days. Another pause. If Reeves Capital doesn't secure funding by mid-October, primary lenders will initiate asset seizure. I looked up. The photograph was still there. The email. The blueprint Rafferty had built over weeks. All of it laid out in front of me. Complete. finished, waiting. I looked at Sylvia, and for the first time since that morning, I smiled. Not broadly, not visibly, but enough. It wasn't a smile that invited conversation. It ended it. "Tell them we're interested," I said. "Schedule it for next week. A beat. And Sylvia, don't use my name." She held my gaze for exactly 1 second. That was all it took. Then she nodded, turned, and left. No questions, no hesitation. She had worked with me for 11 years. She knew what it meant when I didn't explain. And more importantly, she knew when not to ask. My father used to play chess. Not casually, the way immigrants with nothing left often turn to games that cost nothing but teach everything. He told me once that the difference between a good player and a great one was not how well they attacked. It was whether they had already seen the end of the game before the first move was made. I thought about him a great deal in October. The meeting in my private conference room was not on any calendar. Sylvia had cleared the afternoon under a maintenance block, a small administrative fiction we'd relied on for years. Rafferty arrived first. Edmund came 12 minutes later, on time by his standards. He had never once apologized for running a quarter hour behind the rest of the world, and at this point I had stopped expecting him to. I stood at the window. The lake was flat and gray, the color Chicago turns in October when it's deciding what kind of winter to send. "But 4 moves," I said, turning from the glass. "Simultaneous, no waiting to see how the first one lands." Move 1 was Broderick. The anonymous investment meeting Sylvia had arranged would proceed exactly as Broderick's attorneys had requested. The man was hemorrhaging money, bad real estate in Atlanta, a regulatory inquiry already circling the Osaka accounts, a personal debt chain traced through 4 holding companies back to his own signature. He needed $8 million, and he needed it in 30 days. Desperate men sign things they shouldn't. The agreement placed before him would be legitimate in every detail, prepared by a securities attorney I'd trusted for 12 years. But embedded in the disclosure schedules, in language precise enough to be accurate and invisible enough to be missed, were admissions about the Osaka accounts his own attorneys would have told him never to put in writing. After he signed, Rafferty would deliver the complete package shell company records transaction history, the signed agreement itself, to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. "He'll sign," Rafferty said. "Not a prediction, a fact." "Yeah, I know," I said. "That's why I chose this one first." Move 2 was Preston. I couldn't approach him directly. What I needed was someone he wouldn't guard himself against. Professor Harlan Aldridge had taught securities law at Northwestern Pritzker for 19 years. He had supervised Preston's externship. To Preston, Aldridge was a mentor, the kind of authority figure an ambitious young man with no ethical compass mistakes for an ally. I had retained Aldridge 3 weeks earlier. He would reach out to Preston under the pretext of a federal clerkship recommendation. Preston would talk. He always talked when he believed the audience was admiring him. Illinois was a one-party consent state. Every word would be recorded. Move 3 was Rosalind. Rafferty had spent 6 weeks building her profile. Rosalind Reeves was not a woman who had been deceived. She was a woman who had been waiting patiently, strategically for the right moment. She would receive a package, the Osaka records, the financial transfers to Sabrina, the infertility diagnosis. She would understand immediately what the last document meant about the child Broderick believed was his. "She'll move faster than any agency," Rafferty said. "Government investigations take 18 months, I replied. "Rosalind will be on the phone with her attorneys before the package clears her front door." Move 4 was the trust. In 2015, I had restructured my personal assets into an irrevocable marital trust. A single clause, one I had included at my attorney's suggestion and forgotten about for 9 years, allowed immediate asset recovery in the event of documented marital fraud, including the deliberate substitution of genetic material without consent. Activating it required 1 document and 48 hours. Sabrina would not know anything had changed until her attorney reached for accounts that no longer existed in the form she had built her plans around. When I finished, Edmund looked at the table for a moment, then at me. "You know you don't have to carry this alone." "I know," I said. "That's why I called you." He was quiet. Then, "Why didn't you confront them the night you found the message?" I had turned that question over many times in the months since June. If I had confronted them that night, I said, I would have had the truth for 1 evening. This way they'll carry the consequences for the rest of their lives. I paused. "There's a difference." Edmund nodded slowly the way he did when something had settled. "Your father," he said, "would have done exactly the same thing." I didn't answer. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be heard. Sylvia knocked twice, then opened the door. Mrs. Langford called. Sabrina has confirmed dinner this Friday. Alinea, 8 o'clock. I looked at Rafferty. He gave one small nod. The board was set. All 4 moves were loaded. The only thing left was to sit down across from the people who had spent 18 months believing they were the only ones playing. I drove home that evening and helped Sabrina choose what she would wear to dinner. She held up 2 dresses and asked which I preferred. I told her she looked beautiful in both. I wasn't lying. Alinea sits on North Halsted Street in Lincoln Park. 3 Michelin stars, a reputation that extends far beyond Chicago, and a style that turns dinner into theater. Nothing there is accidental. Every plate, every pause, every interaction between staff and guest is choreographed. The room is designed to make people feel as though they are participating in something rare, something elevated, something unforgettable. Sabrina had chosen it well. She had always understood that setting matters. The right lighting, the right table, the right restaurant. The right kind of silence between courses, those things could make almost anything seem more convincing. In the right environment, even deception could pass for elegance. What she had failed to understand was that I had stopped being an audience a long time ago. We arrived at 7:55. The snow had been falling since early evening. Not hard enough to disrupt traffic, only enough to soften the sidewalks and blur the streetlights into pale halos. Lincoln Park looked quieter than usual, its edges muted by winter. Under different circumstances, it might have been called romantic. Sabrina stepped out beside me in the black dress she had finally chosen, after asking which one I preferred. I had told her she looked beautiful in both. She did look beautiful. That was one of the crueler facts of the night. Nothing about the surface of it reflected the truth underneath. The host greeted us with polished discretion and led us through the main dining room where every table looked like part of a carefully staged production. Then he guided us down a short corridor into the private dining area, in the back, where smaller parties were seated away from the floor. Broderick Reeves was already there. I had studied photographs of him. Rafferty had provided several, a corporate headshot surveillance images, a candid shot from a Chicago Tribune business profile. But photographs flatten people. They reduce presence. They strip away the particular quality some men have the ability to occupy a room, not through size or volume, but through the practiced assumption that the room was built for them. Broderick Reeves was one of those men. He was 50 years old, silver hair brushed back from a face that had clearly been maintained with expensive care. His suit was charcoal, tailored with such precision that it did not merely look expensive, it looked inevitable. He stood as we approached, not too quickly, not with any trace of eagerness, but with the calm, measured movement of a man who had never once worried about whether someone would wait for him. He looked at Sabrina first, then at me. "Conrad," Sabrina said, warmly using that social warmth she reserved for evenings when she needed everyone around her to feel at ease. "This is Broderick Reeves. He's been a mentor to me for God. 3 years now. Broderick, my husband, Conrad. Mentor. That was the word she chose." Broderick extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm in a deliberate way, the grip of a man who had learned long ago that a handshake was performance as much as greeting. I met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds before releasing his hand. "Conrad," he said. He spoke my name the way people mention something they are not particularly impressed by. "Sabrina talks about you. She talks about you as well," I said pleasantly. We sat. The first course arrived, a small architectural composition laid out on a white plate, the kind of food that required explanation. The server described it in detail. Broderick listened with a polite half-smile, then took over the evening in the casual, practiced manner of a man who considered control a courtesy. He ordered for the table. He recommended the wine pairing. He mentioned almost in passing that he had eaten at Alinea 4 times. The conversation settled into the rhythm of business dinner small talk, which is never actually small. Every question is a way of measuring another person. Every answer reveals something, whether intended or not. "So, Conrad Operations Management," Broderick said, turning to me with a look of restrained interest. "That must keep you busy. A very," he paused just slightly, "stable kind of work. It has its moments," I said. "I imagine." He smiled. "Sabrina mentioned you've been with the same firm for quite a while. That kind of consistency is admirable. Not everyone is built for the pace of—" He lifted his glass lightly the other side of things. I let the comment settle between us for a beat. "I've learned over the years," I said, "that the most dangerous thing a man can do in any negotiation is let the other side know exactly how much he understands. Broderick smiled more broadly at that. The smile of a man enjoying what he believed was accidental wisdom from an unremarkable source. Wise, he said. My father taught me, I replied. He nodded once, already moving on. Midway through the second course, he mentioned Osaka. He did it casually, the way people mention places they consider extensions of their own importance. A business trip the month before, a partner firm, shipping logistics, a restructuring arrangement. He used the word restructuring several times, which is what men often say when they mean something more complicated than they are willing to describe plainly. I listened. I noted the name of the partner firm. I noted the timeline. I noted the effortless confidence with which he discussed those details in front of a man he believed was too ordinary to understand their significance. Everything he said aligned within 2 weeks, with the transaction patterns Rafferty had already traced through the shell registrations. Broderick was confirming information freely, voluntarily, over candlelight and expensive wine. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip. By the third course, the dynamic between him and Sabrina no longer required interpretation. It was not obvious. They were too careful for obviousness. But there were small things. The way his attention sharpened when she spoke, the way she angled her shoulders toward him without seeming to notice, the way his hand rested on the table just a few inches from hers, not touching. Never touching, but close enough to say what touch would have said more recklessly. At one point, he looked at her with the expression of a man who believed he had already won something. I thought of my father's chessboard. The wood had grown smooth over the years, from repetition and thought. He used to tell me that the most important move in any game is the one your opponent does not recognize as a move at all. I set down my glass, smiled at something Sabrina said, and let the evening continue. Dessert arrived with ceremony, small, exact, almost too precise to eat. Alinea understood endings. They staged them as carefully as beginnings. Broderick refilled Sabrina's wineglass himself, leaning slightly across the table with the ease of someone long accustomed to crossing invisible lines without appearing to cross them. Then he turned toward her and spoke in Japanese. His voice lowered, not enough to become a whisper, only enough to mark the words as private. It was the tone people use when they believe they are safe, because the room around them does not understand the language they are speaking. Sabrina answered immediately, fluidly, quietly, without hesitation. They had done this before, more than once, probably many times. I lowered my gaze to my wineglass. The candlelight moved along the surface of the table. Beyond the restaurant windows, snow was still falling over North Halsted Street, soft and steady and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. I understood every word they had just said to each other, every word, and I did not move a single muscle in my face. Because in moments like that, stillness is not passivity. It is discipline. Men like Broderick often mistake silence for ignorance. They assume calm means absence. They believe that if a person does not react, then nothing has been understood. It is one of the more useful weaknesses powerful men tend to have. They are so accustomed to being underestimated by no one that they become careless in front of the people they themselves underestimate. I let them continue. I let Sabrina smile. I let Broderick sit there in the comfort of his own certainty. And I kept my expression exactly the same, because the evening had already given me what it was meant to give me. Confirmation, not suspicion, not intuition, confirmation. And that is always more valuable. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, course by course, word by word, the performance went on. Only now, I was no longer watching it as a husband. I was watching it as a man who finally understood the board. My father taught me Japanese when I was 11 years old. He had learned it himself over 3 years of working in Osaka in the early 1970s before he came to America. He taught me the way he taught me everything, with patience, with repetition, and with the quiet understanding that knowledge is the one thing the world cannot repossess. He used to say that a language is not just words, it is a way of seeing. The people who speak it show you, without meaning to, exactly how they think. Sitting at that table in Alinea, I was grateful for every single lesson. It began with the wine. Broderick made some remark about the vintage, a 2019 Burgundy the sommelier had recommended casual and appreciative, the kind of comment that establishes fluency without announcing it. Sabrina responded in kind. Her Japanese was good. Not native, but practiced the accent of someone who had put in deliberate effort over a meaningful amount of time. I wondered briefly, when she had started learning, I had never heard her speak a word of it in 12 years. Then Broderick glanced at me. I was looking at my plate, cutting my food with the even unhurried strokes of a man with no particular interest in the conversation at the other end of the table. He looked back at Sabrina. His voice dropped slightly, not enough to seem secretive, just enough to be private. The way you speak when you are certain the words are safe. Look at his face. He actually thinks he's about to become a father. Quite pathetic, isn't it? I set down my knife, picked up my wine glass, put it back down. I kept my eyes on my plate. Sabrina's reply came low and precise. Keep your voice down. Let him enjoy his happy little illusion a while longer. Preston said the paperwork will be ready by the time the baby is born. I was aware of the candle flame on the table, the way it moved without a draft, small, steady, indifferent to everything around it. I thought, keep eating. Keep your face where it is. You have spent 30 years doing exactly this, sitting across from people who have underestimated you and letting them believe they are right. This is no different. This is just the most expensive version of it. Broderick leaned back slightly in his chair. Harmon's certificate will be filed at the same time. By the time Conrad realizes what's happening, he'll have no legal standing to fight back. He'll likely be in a facility. The house, the accounts, all of it will be transferred. And after the divorce, Sabrina did not hesitate. I cut another piece of food. I chewed it slowly. There is a discipline, I learned it from my father, though he never named it, that involves the complete separation of what you hear from what your face does. He used it at negotiating tables. He used it when creditors spoke to him in ways that assumed he could not understand them. He called it once the courtesy of appearing smaller than you are. I had been practicing it for 46 years. I was grateful for that too. Broderick smiled, a small, private thing directed at Sabrina across the rim of his glass. You married a generous man, Sabrina. You married a generous man. Sabrina's reply came without a pause, without inflection, in the tone of someone stating something they have long since resolved. I married a useful man. There's a difference. I married a useful man. There's a difference. The table was quiet for a moment after that. I set my fork down on the plate, gently, precisely the way you set something down when you want to be sure it makes no sound. I looked at the surface of the table, the white linen, the half-empty glasses, the small architectural remnants of a meal that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Then Sabrina placed her hand on her stomach. She did it slowly, the way she had done hundreds of times in the past months, the gesture I had watched from across rooms, from doorways, from the passenger seat of the car on the way to prenatal appointments I had attended, with the genuine hope of a man who has been foolish enough to allow himself to hope again. I had always read it as tenderness. Broderick watched her do it. The expression on his face was not tenderness. It was ownership, the particular expression of a man surveying something he believes belongs to him by right of acquisition. He looked at her hand on her stomach, the way men like him look at things they have purchased with satisfaction and without warmth. And something in me, something that had been very quiet for a very long time, went completely cold. Not angry. Cold is different from angry. Anger is fire, and fire is visible. And visible is the last thing I intended to be at that table. Cold is the thing that comes after. The thing that does not need to announce itself. I placed my knife and fork down, side by side, parallel the way the restaurant had set them. I aligned them carefully against the edge of the plate. Then I looked up. I looked directly at Broderick Reeves. He was mid-sentence something about a development project in Miami, pivoting back to English, now having apparently decided the private portion of the evening was concluded. He was the kind of man who transitioned between languages and registers, the way other men change lanes on a highway smoothly, without signaling, without checking whether anyone else was adjusting. I raised my wine glass. He noticed the movement and paused courteously in case I was about to say something. I looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then I said in Japanese, clean unhurried, the accent my father had given me, and that 30 years of intermittent use had kept intact. The wine tonight has been truly excellent. However, I must say the conversation has been far more illuminating. The table went still. Sabrina's fork slipped from her fingers. It struck the rim of her porcelain plate, a small sound, precise and clean, the kind that carries further in a quiet room than it has any right to. I set my wine glass down. I picked up my knife and fork again, and I returned to my meal. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when every person inside it realizes at exactly the same moment that the game they have been playing has ended. Not because someone won, but because the board has been overturned and no one saw whose hand did it. That silence lasted about 4 seconds. It was not an empty silence. It had weight. It pressed against the table, against the glasses, against the carefully controlled expressions of the two people sitting across from me. It was the kind of silence that does not merely follow shock, it defines it. Then Sabrina moved first. She lowered her wine glass onto the table with a care that was just a fraction too deliberate, and she looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately. I had seen it before at charity events, at dinners and rooms where something inconvenient had happened and needed to be rewritten before anyone else decided what it meant. It was the face she used for narrative control. "Conrad," she said, her voice even, and pleasant, her tone calibrated with exquisite precision. "You don't speak Japanese. You must have misheard something." It was a smart response, simple, contained, designed to restore order before disorder could become fact. For someone who didn't know her well, it might even have worked. I looked at her for a moment, then I answered in Japanese at a completely conversational volume. "If you believe I don't speak Japanese, imagine how I must feel about everything else I've heard." If you believe I don't speak Japanese, imagine how I must feel about everything else. The words landed and the air in the room changed. I turned to Broderick. He had not moved much, but stillness can reveal as much as motion. One hand remained on the table. The other still held his wine glass, though now with the rigid precision of a man whose body has chosen posture before his mind has fully decided on strategy. His expression had shifted through several states in the last half-minute and settled somewhere between caution and calculation. He had been surprised. What mattered now was that he was trying not to show how deeply. I switched to German. "The Osaka accounts. Greenfield Logistics GmbH, registered in Delaware, operating in Kobe. 3 separate transaction cycles over 18 months. The amounts were always just below the reporting threshold, very tidy, I must say. The Osaka accounts. Greenfield Logistics GmbH, registered in Delaware, operationally based in Kobe. 3 separate transaction cycles over 18 months. Each amount just below the reporting threshold. Very tidy, I have to say." I watched the change in his face. Not dramatic. Men like Broderick train themselves out of dramatic reactions. But the color shifted very slightly beneath the surface. The wine glass tilted by a degree or two before he corrected it. Then he placed it down with a level of control that itself revealed too much. I did not pause long enough for either of them to recover. I switched to French. The 3 accounts. Banque Privée de Genève, account ending in 7741. Cayman National, ending in 3308, and the most recent opened last March in Singapore, ending in 9914. Rafferty spent 6 weeks finding the third one. He was impressed by the structure, not enough to miss it, but impressed nonetheless. The 3 accounts: Banque Privée de Genève, account ending in 7741, Cayman National, ending in 3308, and the most recent opened last March in Singapore, ending in 9914. Rafferty spent 6 weeks finding the third. He was impressed by the structure, not sufficiently, but impressed nonetheless. Broderick placed both hands flat on the table. It was a small movement, but small movements matter in moments like that. It was the gesture of a man confirming that something solid still existed beneath him. Sabrina had gone very still now. She was no longer trying to interrupt, no longer trying to smile this away. She was looking at me with an expression I did not entirely recognize, which told me it was real. I turned to Mandarin. "It's the Shanghai partner, the one named Liu Weiming. At least that's the name in the IRS case file. Though according to your own records, he doesn't actually exist. The Shanghai partner, the one listed under the name in the IRS filing. Though according to your own records, he does not actually exist." By then, neither of them was pretending anymore. Not in any meaningful sense. The masks had not exactly fallen off. People like Sabrina and Broderick do not lose control that cleanly. But the masks had cracked, and once that happens, you can see the strain underneath. I returned to English. "Which language would you prefer we continue in, Broderick?" I asked. "I have one more, but I don't think you want to hear what I have to say in Spanish." He said nothing. I had not expected him to. Silence was the only thing either of them still had available that might pass for dignity. I took my napkin, folded it once, and placed it beside my plate in the neat, expected way the restaurant preferred. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and removed a small USB drive. It was an ordinary object, black, unremarkable, the sort of thing any office supply store kept in bins near the register. I placed it in the center of the white tablecloth. Its appearance was modest. Its contents were not. Then I looked at Sabrina. When I spoke to her, my voice changed slightly. The hard precision remained, but beneath it there was something quieter now, something tired. the register of a man who had been carrying the same weight for a very long time and had finally made the decision to put it down. "I loved you," I said. I let the sentence stand on its own for a second. That part was never a performance. She did not blink. Or perhaps she did and I did not notice. There are moments when the body stops cataloging anything except what matters. "Whatever you chose to do with that," I continued. "I have documentation of all of it." I glanced once at the USB. "The drive contains everything Rafferty found. Your attorneys will want to review it before they advise you on next steps." A brief pause. "I would recommend finding very good ones." She did not speak. Her fingers moved just slightly toward the drive, then stopped. I wondered whether she understood in that moment that touching it would make all of this real in a way even language had not yet done. Then I stood. I put on my coat, the same wool coat I had worn into the restaurant. Practical, dark, durable. Sabrina had once suggested I replace it with something more refined, something that better reflected the life we supposedly had built together. I had never replaced it. For the first time, that felt less like habit and more like instinct. I turned to Broderick. "The investment group you've been pursuing for the past 2 months," I said, "is mine." That got his attention in a way the languages had not. "The anonymous buyer your attorneys have been negotiating with is also mine." His eyes stayed on me now, fully, no longer dismissive, no longer superior, just focused. "You've been asking me for $8 million, Broderick." I let that settle. "The man your companion called useful, and nothing more at this table 30 minutes ago." Sabrina's face changed at that. Only slightly, but enough. "I'll be declining the investment," I said. "I don't believe Reeves Capital represents a sound business opportunity." Broderick looked at me then, as if he were trying for the first time all evening to understand who I actually was. It occurred to me that it was the first honest thing he had done since we sat down. I buttoned my coat. I did not say anything else. There was nothing left that needed saying. The USB was on the table. The accounts had been named. The lies had been brought into the open. Everything they had built in private over 18 months had been acknowledged in less than 10 minutes. An acknowledgement once achieved changes the architecture of everything that follows. I turned and walked out through the private dining room corridor. The front room of the restaurant was still full. Other tables, other guests, other conversations rising and falling at ordinary volume, other evenings proceeding according to plan. No one looked up. No one noticed me in any meaningful way. Whatever had happened in the back had stayed in the back. The restaurant, like all expensive places, knew how to protect privacy. I pushed open the front door. The snow was still falling on North Halsted Street. It had fallen all evening with that same patient indifference collecting on parked cars' awnings, sidewalks' bare branches. Chicago, in November. The cold met me immediately clean and sharp, not punishing but clarifying. I stepped onto the sidewalk and stopped. For a moment I tilted my face upward and let the snow touch it. Behind me, through the front glass, I could see the private dining area in the distance. Sabrina had one hand pressed against her mouth. Broderick had his phone out. Neither of them was looking at the other. The performance was over, for all of us. I put my hands in my pockets. Then I began to walk, and with each step I felt something leave me. Not grief. That had been there too long to vanish in a single night. Not triumph either. What had happened in that room was not victory in any clean sense. There are confrontations that satisfy the ego. This was not one of them. It was something quieter than that. A release. The end of having to wonder whether what I suspected was true. The end of waiting for one more explanation, one more lie, one more carefully managed version of reality to be offered up as if it deserved consideration. The city around me continued without pause. Headlights moved through the snow. A cab passed. Somewhere down the block, a couple laughed under an umbrella. Chicago did not care what had just ended in the back room of a restaurant, and there was something almost merciful in that. The world had not changed. Only my place in it had. I kept walking the snow, gathering lightly on my shoulders, and I did not look back again. I drove home from Alinea through the snow. Not to Lincoln Park. I had moved my personal belongings to an apartment in Streeterville 3 weeks earlier, one box at a time, on the mornings when Sabrina went to her prenatal appointments. I had left everything else in place. The furniture, the photographs on the mantel, the spare bedroom I had converted into a nursery over the summer, the one with the pale yellow walls and the white crib still in its box, unassembled, waiting for a December that was going to arrive differently than either of us had planned. I drove north along the lakefront, past the frozen edges of Lake Michigan, and I felt something I had not felt in several months. Clarity. Not happiness, not anger, just the cold, clean feeling of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why. I called Sylvia first. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. Sylvia did not wait by accident. The trust, I said. Already prepared, she said. The registered agent received the filing package at 6 this evening. 48-hour processing window begins tonight. By Sunday morning, the recovery provisions will be in effect. Thank you. Of course. A pause, brief, professional, with the particular quality of someone who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. She decided against it. Good night, Conrad. I kept driving. Rafferty answered before the first ring had finished. It went as expected, he asked. Better, I said. He confirmed the Osaka structure himself, over dinner, voluntarily. A short silence. That's either very stupid or very arrogant. In my experience, I said, those two things are usually the same thing. I'll have the IRS package submitted before midnight, Rafferty said. FBI Chicago field office gets the duplicate filing simultaneously. The Harmon complaint goes to IDFPR tonight as well. I'll use the formal complaint portal. Timestamp will show everything was filed independently of each other. Good. Keep them independent. Already the plan. Another pause. The Whitfield complaint. I had thought about Whitfield, the doctor who had taken $60,000 to swap a sperm sample, who had looked me in the eye and shaken my hand and accepted my gratitude in a clinic on North Michigan Avenue while knowing exactly what he had done. File it, I said. Same board. Done by 1 a.m. I thanked him and ended the call. Aldridge picked up on the third ring, which was unusual for him. He was a man who answered promptly. I was wondering when I'd hear from you tonight, he said. It's time, Professor. A brief silence on his end, not hesitation, just the pause of a man confirming something internally before committing it to words. I'll reach out to Preston tomorrow morning. Clerkship recommendation pretext as discussed. He'll want to meet within the week. He will, I said. He's been waiting for that call for 2 years. I know, Aldridge said, and there was something in his voice, not quite sadness, but the particular weariness of a man who has watched a student choose the wrong road and is now required to stand at the end of it. I'll handle it carefully. I know you will. That's why I called you. The apartment in Streeterville was on the 22nd floor, east-facing with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake. I had chosen it for that reason. Lake Michigan at night. In November is not a comforting sight. It is too dark and too vast and too indifferent to comfort anything. But it is honest. It has no interest in pretending to be smaller than it is. And at that particular moment in my life, I found that quality more valuable than comfort. I did not turn on the lights. I sat down in the chair by the window, a single armchair I had brought from the Lincoln Park house, the one from my home office, the chair my father had sat in the last time he visited, 2 years before he died. I sat in the dark and I looked out at the water. And then, without deciding to, I let myself feel it. Not all of it. Not the full accumulated weight of 18 months of knowledge carefully managed and suppressed. Just what was in the room with me at that moment. What had followed me from the restaurant and up the elevator, and through the door of an apartment that still smelled faintly of the boxes I had unpacked 3 weeks ago. The tears came quietly. Not the kind that announces itself, no tightening of the chest, no sound. Just the simple fact of them there in the dark, without an audience and without a reason to stop them. I cried for the child I had spent 8 months preparing to love, for the nursery I had painted in a house I would not live in by the time December arrived. For 12 years I had believed were real in the ways that mattered, the dinners, the mornings, the 1,000 small accumulated moments that now required reclassification in a way I had not yet fully completed. I cried for Preston. That one took longer to arrive, and it was different from the others, heavier without the clean edges that grief sometimes has when the loss is clear. Preston was not lost. He was still alive. Still a practicing student at one of the country's best law schools. Still the young man I had watched grow from a difficult adolescence into something that had looked for a long time like becoming. He had sat across from me at hundreds of dinners and called me Dad with an ease that I had taken as evidence of something real. I had been wrong about what it was evidence of. That was a specific kind of pain, the kind that does not come from losing something, but from understanding that what you thought you had was something else entirely. I did not cry for Sabrina. I had finished grieving that marriage on the night in June, when I sat in the dark office and read Preston's message on a phone left on a desk. By the time I walked out of Alinea tonight, that particular door had been closed for months. What remained was not grief, It was paperwork. And paperwork, in my experience, is manageable. I called Edmund at 11:47. He answered on the first ring. "It's done," I said, the first part. "How are you?" he asked. "Not the plan, you." I was quiet for a moment. Outside the lake was the same dark it had been all night, unchanged by anything that had happened in the past 4 hours. "I'm still here," I said. "That's enough for tonight." Edmund was quiet on his end for a moment. Then, "That's enough." I stood and walked to the window. My father had built everything from nothing, not from inheritance or connections, but from the patient accumulation of work and the quiet understanding that the world does not owe you fairness. It only owes you the consequences of your own choices. Sabrina had made her choices. Broderick had made his. Preston. I stopped. Preston was still my son. Whatever he had done, whatever had been planned and documented and was now in the process of being dismantled, that fact existed independently of all of it. In a place where legal proceedings and trust clauses and FBI filings did not reach, he was still my son. That was not going to change. And that, more than the IVF and more than the fabricated evidence and more than any of the rest of it, was the part that was going to take the longest to find a place for. I stood at the window for a long time. My phone vibrated on the table behind me. I did not need to look at the screen to know, but I looked anyway. Sabrina, the 11th time. I watched it vibrate twice more. Then I reached over, declined the call, and placed the phone face down on the table. That night I slept better than I had in months. There are nights when the right thing and the hard thing turn out to be the same thing. And once you have done it, once the decision has been made, and the calls placed, and the files submitted, and the last piece of the evening set quietly into place, what remains is surprisingly simple. You go to sleep, and you let the consequences begin their work. A week passed. I know that because I counted the way you count when you are waiting for something large and irreversible to begin moving. Each morning, I woke in the Streeterville apartment, made coffee, and sat by the east-facing window while the lake changed color with the light. Each evening I returned from Willis Tower, ate alone, and reviewed whatever Rafferty had sent through the secure channel. The days were quiet in the way that the period before, a structural failure, is always quiet, not peaceful, just the absence of sound before something shifts. On the 8th morning after Alinea Rafferty called at 6:45. "Rosalind Reeves has responded," he said. I set down my coffee and listened. He had delivered the package to an intermediary on a Tuesday, a courier service Rafferty used for sensitive materials, untraceable to Global Nexus or to me. The package had arrived at the Reeves residence in Lincoln Park, a different part of Lincoln Park, from where I had spent 12 years quieter, older money on Wednesday afternoon. Rosalind Reeves had not cried. She had not called her husband. According to Rafferty's source within the building's concierge service, she had signed for the package, carried it upstairs herself, and been on the phone within the hour. Not to a friend, not to a family member, to the offices of Harrington and Cole, a firm that specialized in high net worth divorce litigation and had, according to Rafferty's research, a particular reputation for asset recovery in cases involving concealed financial structures. She moved faster than any agency, Rafferty said. "You told me she would," I replied. "I was right," he said, without satisfaction. Rafferty never took satisfaction in being right about things like this. It was one of the qualities that had kept him useful to me for 15 years. The following morning, Thursday, the joint accounts held under Broderick and Rosalind Reeves were frozen. All of them. The primary operating account, the household account. 3 investment brokerage accounts that Rafferty had been tracking for 2 months. Rosalind's attorneys had moved under an emergency asset preservation motion, citing evidence of undisclosed financial activity and potential dissipation of marital assets. The motion had been granted by a Cook County judge at 7:42 in the morning. By noon, Rosalind had forwarded a separate package built by her own attorneys, using the Osaka documentation Conrad had provided as foundation and supplemented with material they had apparently been compiling independently for some time to both the SEC's Chicago Regional Office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The SEC filing cited potential securities fraud related to the shell company structure. The FBI filing referenced the same IRS report Rafferty had submitted the previous Friday. 2 agencies, 2 independent filings, the same underlying facts approaching from 2 directions simultaneously. She added material of her own, Rafferty said. Her attorneys had been building a file for 8 months. She was already watching him. We just gave her the piece she was missing. I thought about that for a moment. The idea that Rosalind Reeves had been conducting her own quiet investigation that there had been running parallel to mine. Another person in this city, counting days and assembling evidence and waiting for the right moment. There is a particular solidarity in that, even between people who have never met and never will. Monday morning, Rafferty told me Broderick had arrived at the offices of Reeves Capital on the 41st floor of 150 North Riverside Plaza at his usual time. His keycard had not worked. He had tried it twice, then a third time. The lobby security guard, a man who had been at that building for 11 years and who had greeted Broderick by name every morning, for 7 of them, had stepped forward and informed him that his building access had been suspended pending legal proceedings. Broderick Reeves had stood in the lobby of his own company for approximately 10 minutes. Then he had left. Rafferty had warned me about Rosalind when I first mentioned her name back in October. She won't get angry, he had said. She'll perform a surgery. I had understood completely what he meant. Anger makes noise. Surgery is silent and precise and does not announce itself until the procedure is already complete. He's starting to understand who the anonymous investor was, Rafferty added. He called the main line at Willis Tower yesterday afternoon. Sylvia didn't answer, per your instruction. Good. He called twice more after that. A pause. He also reached out to his attorneys about the investment agreement he signed. They have apparently informed him that the embedded disclosures constitute a voluntary acknowledgement and that there is no viable legal remedy. I said nothing to that. There was nothing to say. He had signed it willingly in a private dining room at a restaurant he had probably visited 4 times, because he had believed the man across the table from him was someone whose name it wasn't necessary to know. There's one more thing, Rafferty said. His voice had shifted slightly, not to seriousness, which had been constant throughout the call, but to a different register. Careful. The way he sounded when the information he was delivering had personal dimensions, he felt it was not his place to comment on. Broderick tried to reach Conrad directly this morning. He called the main Willis Tower line. He did not sound like the man at Alinea. I imagine not, I said. He also called Sabrina. Rafferty paused. From what I was able to determine, the conversation was not friendly. He's learned about the DNA. He knows the child isn't his. He's not handling that information calmly. I thought about that. About Broderick Reeves standing in a lobby that no longer recognized his keycard, calling a woman who had used him the same way she had used me as a means to an end, and discovering in the span of 48 hours that the end he had been promised had never existed. Are there safety concerns? I asked. I'm monitoring it, Rafferty said. I'll let you know if the situation escalates. Do that. I ended the call and sat by the window. 30 minutes later, my phone rang, Sabrina's number. I had declined 11 calls in the week since Alinea. I had looked at the screen each time, watched the name, and let it go to voicemail. There had been 17 voicemails. I had not listened to any of them. This time I answered. Her voice was different. Not the voice from Alinea, not the composed, practiced voice of a woman managing an evening she believed she controlled. This was something underneath that voice. Quieter, unsteady in the way that voices become when the performance has been removed and what remains is just the person. Conrad, a breath. Please, Broderick he's threatening me. He found out about the DNA. He knows the baby isn't his, and he's saying things that are scaring me, Conrad. I'm scared. I sat still and listened. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. The tremor in it was real. I had spent 12 years learning to read her voice, and whatever else had been false. The fear in it at that moment was not performed. And I thought about a night in January 10 months earlier, the snow against the windows, the yellow living room light, her face against my shoulder, her voice breaking in exactly this same register, asking me to trust her. I had trusted her then. I did not make the same mistake a second time. You should call your attorney Sabrina, I said quietly. If you believe you're in immediate danger, call the police. That's what they're for. A silence on her end, the silence of a person who expected a different answer, and has not yet determined what to do with the one they received. Conrad. Good night, I said. I ended the call. I set the phone on the table and looked out at the lake, which was the same dark it always was and did not require anything from me. 2 weeks after Alinea, on a Tuesday morning, cold enough that the windows of my Streeterville apartment had frosted on the inside, Aldridge called at exactly 8 o'clock. He was a man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms, and he spoke the way people speak when they understand that precision matters more than volume. It's done, he said. Your son confessed to everything. He just didn't know that's what he was doing. I sat down. Aldridge had reached out to Preston on the Monday after Thanksgiving, a timing he had chosen. Deliberately, he explained, because the week after a holiday has a particular quality of lowered vigilance. People have spent days with family. They return to work slightly softened, slightly less defended, still carrying the residual warmth of a table that felt like belonging. Preston had received the message within the hour and responded within 20 minutes. The pretext was a federal clerkship, a position with the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago, the kind of appointment that arrives once in a career, and only if the right person makes the right call at the right moment. Aldridge had framed it carefully. He had been asked to recommend a former student. He had been thinking of Preston. He had a few questions about Preston's current work before putting the name forward. Preston had agreed to meet the following morning. He had arrived at Aldridge's office on Michigan Avenue at 9 a.m., wearing a suit he had clearly put on that morning with some care. Aldridge described this detail without commentary. I understood it anyway. Preston had dressed for an audience he wanted to impress. The conversation had lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Aldridge had guided it the way he guided every conversation he considered important, not with direct questions, but with the particular technique of a man who understands that the most effective way to get someone to reveal themselves is to make them feel that they are being admired. He had asked about Preston's current projects, about the complexity of the legal strategies he was pursuing, about the resourcefulness required to manage situations that existed, as Aldridge had put it, in the space between what the law technically permits and what it has not yet specifically prohibited. Preston had understood this as an invitation. He had talked for 2 hours and 14 minutes. He described the fabricated evidence, the altered hotel receipts, the paid affidavits, the arrangement with Dr. Harmon, and the detailed, technical language of someone who considers competence in wrongdoing a form of professional accomplishment. He outlined the asset transfer structure. He explained the timeline when the divorce filing would be triggered, when Harmon's psychiatric evaluation would be submitted, how the sequence had been designed so that by the time any resistance was mounted, the legal mechanisms would already be locked in place. He had said my name 17 times in 2 hours and 14 minutes. Not once had he used the word father. Aldridge told me this last part carefully, with the particular gentleness of a man delivering information he knows will land in a specific place. I thought you should know, he said. Yes, I said. Thank you. Cook County law enforcement, working in coordination with the FBI's Chicago field office, had executed the arrest warrant at 3:47 that afternoon. Preston had been in a conference room on the 32nd floor of his firm's office on LaSalle Street, a standard Tuesday afternoon meeting, from what Rafferty's contact had reported. The agents had entered through the main reception. The arrest had taken approximately 4 minutes. It had happened in front of 6 colleagues and the firm's senior receptionist, a woman who had worked at that desk for 19 years, and who had apparently not moved or spoken a word during the entire 4 minutes. Aldridge relayed this without editorializing. He was a thorough man. An hour later, Dr. Leonard Harmon had been taken into custody at his private practice in Evanston. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation had issued a summary suspension of his medical license, simultaneously a provision available under Illinois law when evidence of professional fraud is sufficiently documented to constitute an immediate public safety concern. The suspension was effective as of the moment of signing. Dr. Whitfield at the Fertility Center on North Michigan Avenue had received a federal grand jury subpoena at 6 that evening. He had not been arrested, not yet. The investigation was, as Rafferty would tell me later, proceeding along a timeline consistent with the complexity of the underlying conduct. When Aldridge finished, I thanked him. I told him I would be in touch about the next steps regarding Preston's representation, whether to provide resources for his legal defense, whether to maintain any form of contact during the proceedings. These were decisions I had not yet made. I told Aldridge that honestly. Take your time, he said. There's no correct answer to that one. I ended the call. The apartment was very quiet. Outside Chicago was doing what Chicago does in early December, committing to winter with the particular seriousness of a city that has never found winter remarkable, only inevitable. The lake was gray. The sky was lower than it had been a week ago. I stood and walked to the desk. In the corner of the desk, between the lamp and the edge of the surface, there was a photograph in a plain wooden frame. Preston on the day of his Northwestern graduation, law school spring of 2022. He was wearing the cap and gown, holding the portfolio that contained the degree. looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has just completed something difficult and is allowing himself briefly to acknowledge it. He was smiling, not the careful social smile I had watched him practice over years of professional development. The real one, the one that showed up rarely and always by accident. The one that looked like the boy I had known before, the boy had decided what kind of man he intended to become. I had been in the audience that day. I had watched them call his name and watched him cross the stage and thought with the particular fullness of a feeling that does not have a clean word in any language, I know this is what it was all for. 30 years of silence, the early mornings, the decisions made in the interest of the long game rather than the immediate one. The relationships kept at careful distance so that nothing could be used against the people I loved. This boy, this man, this moment. I picked up the photograph. I looked at it for a long time. Then I set it face down on the desk, carefully, not with force. The glass did not crack, the frame did not shift. It simply lay there face down, the image against the wood, visible to no one. I did not throw it away. I could not do that. But I could not look at it anymore either. There is a space between those two things, between discarding and keeping, that does not have a name, but that most people will recognize if they have ever stood in it. I stood in it for a moment, with my hand still resting on the back of the frame. Then I took my hand away. The knock at the study door was Sylvia's two precise sounds, her standard signal. She entered quietly. Her eyes went to the desk, to the frame lying face down beside the lamp. She did not comment on it. In 11 years, Sylvia had developed an accurate understanding of which observations were useful and which were intrusions, and she had never once confused the two. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "Rafferty just called. Sabrina was admitted to Northwestern Memorial 2 hours ago." A pause. "The baby is coming early." I looked at her. "How early?" 3 weeks. I was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the snow had begun, not the light decorative snow of early November, but the serious kind. The kind that accumulates with intention and does not apologize for the inconvenience. December 15th had been the date on every document, every prenatal calendar. Every carefully marked notation in the shared household schedule I had continued to observe for months after I knew what I knew. 3 weeks early, put this at the last days of November, the first days of December. The child had arrived on its own schedule, indifferent to the legal and personal machinery surrounding its existence. I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. I looked out at the snow for one more second. Then I turned back to Sylvia. "Get me the DNA laboratory on the line, through Aldridge's office. I want everything properly documented from the first moment." Sylvia nodded once and left without asking for clarification. She never did. Edmund showed up that evening without being asked. 9 o'clock, a bottle of scotch and 2 glasses. No call ahead. He simply knew the way certain people develop over decades, an involuntary attunement to the people they care about. Some people know when to offer advice. Edmund always knew when to just sit. He found the glasses without asking, poured without ceremony, and we carried our drinks to the chairs by the east window. Outside Chicago, snow was coming down the serious way, not decorative, not tentative, the kind that changes the character of the city by morning. We sat without speaking for a while. Edmund had always treated silence as a legitimate form of conversation. Over 31 years I had come to rely on that more than I had ever told him. "I've never told anyone the real reason I agreed to the IVF," I said. Edmund held his glass and waited. "You know about Daniel. You were there after." I looked at the snow against the window. What I never put into words for anyone, including myself, is that I never fully closed that door. I told myself I had. I built things, kept moving, did what you do. But the door was still there. I turned my glass in my hands. When Sabrina came to me that January crying, asking me to try, I didn't say yes because she asked. I said yes because I thought maybe this was how it came back. The second chance I'd told myself I would never have. I stopped. They knew that. They looked at the thing I wanted most in the world, and they used it. That was the architecture of it, Ed. Not the money, those were just the mechanics. The foundation was that. Edmund was quiet. Then, "What are you going to do about the child, the baby born tonight?" "Nothing," I said. "The child is innocent. That child didn't choose any of this." I set my glass down. "I made arrangements 3 weeks ago. A discretionary trust, separate administrator, no connection to my name. Structured so that if the mother needs support for the child's care, the resources are there. Education, medical, basic stability." I paused. "She'll never know it's from me." Edmund looked at me for a moment. Your father, he said quietly, would have done exactly the same thing. We sat a while longer without speaking. Do you want to know what the worst part is? I said eventually. He didn't answer, which was his way of saying yes. Not Sabrina. That chapter had been set aside since June. What remained there was not grief. It was something colder and quieter that I had already found a place for. And not what they planned to do to me. Those were threats to things that can be rebuilt. I looked at the window. It's Preston. I picked up my glass, held it without drinking. I gave that kid everything I knew how to give. The schools, the opportunities, everything I built in silence. Part of the reason I built it was for him. So the doors would be open before he reached them. I shook my head. And somewhere along the way, I missed something central. And I don't know what it was. I've gone over every year I can remember, and I can't find the moment. I set the glass down. I'm going to spend a long time not knowing what that was. Edmund reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. There are moments when that is the only appropriate response, not because words would be inadequate, but because the person speaking doesn't need words. They need the simple confirmation that someone is present, that the weight they are describing has been heard. The bottle was most of the way gone by 10:30. Neither of us had eaten. Neither of us mentioned it. My phone rang at 11. Rafferty, the DNA results have been confirmed. The child is not yours, Conrad. A pause. It is not Broderick's either. The documentation is ready to transmit to Northwestern Memorial at your instruction. I looked at the clock, 11:03. The snow was still falling, steady, committed, unchanged. I thought about Sabrina in a hospital room across the city. The machines, the hours, the particular solitude of labor. About the child arriving into a situation no child should arrive into. Whatever she had done, she was alone tonight. The child was innocent. Send it in the morning, I said. Rafferty was quiet. All right. Let her have tonight. I ended the call. Edmund was watching me. Something passed between us that didn't require words, the confirmation that I had made the right call. Not the strategic call, the right one. Outside, Chicago was buried in white, and the lake was somewhere beyond the snow, patient and permanent the way it had always been. The morning Sabrina gave birth was a Thursday in December. Chicago had buried itself under 11 inches of snow overnight, and the city was moving slowly, carefully, the way it does when winter reminds it who is actually in charge. The lake had disappeared entirely, not just its far shore, but the near one too. The whole visible world reduced to white and gray, and the muffled absence of sound that heavy snowfall produces in a city that is otherwise never quiet. I was at my desk on the 47th floor at 7 a.m. I had not slept much. I did not go to the hospital. Sylvia arrived at 7:15 as she always did. She was carrying her tablet and 2 sealed envelopes, which she set on the corner of my desk without comment. Both had been prepared the previous week, contents verified. Recipients confirmed, delivery instructions documented. She had simply been waiting for the instruction to send. I looked at them for a moment. Then I picked up a pen and signed the authorization forms attached to each. The first envelope was addressed to the legal department at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, routed through Aldridge's office as the originating counsel. Properly formatted under Illinois family law procedure, it contained the DNA laboratory report, certified and witnessed confirming that the child born that morning was not biologically related to me. It also confirmed as the secondary finding that Broderick Reeves held no biological claim either. The report was factual, precise, and complete. The second envelope contained documentation of a different kind. The federal arrest warrant for Broderick Reeves executed by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, in coordination with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI Chicago Field Office, had been signed the previous Friday. The charges were tax evasion under 26 U.S.C. Section 7201 wire fraud, under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343 and money laundering under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956. The warrant had been held pending final confirmation of the IRS filing and the secondary SEC referral. As of 9 a.m. that morning, both confirmations were in place. The warrant was now active. I handed both envelopes back to Sylvia. She called the courier from her tablet before she had fully turned away from the desk. The trust activation had completed its 48-hour processing window at 6 that morning, 2 hours before I arrived. The The registered agent had filed the recovery documentation with the Cook County Recorder of Deeds at 6:07 a.m., which meant that, as of that moment, the Lincoln Park house was no longer in Sabrina's name. The two joint bank accounts, one checking one savings, the latter holding the accumulated balance that Sabrina had presumably been planning to access as part of the divorce proceedings, had been transferred into the trust's control. The car, a 3-year-old vehicle registered jointly, had been flagged for recovery through the same mechanism. There was nothing dramatic about this, no confrontation, no ceremony. Just the quiet completion of a legal process that had been moving through its proper channels since the night I had called Sylvia from the car outside Alinea. Sabrina's attorneys would discover all of this during business hours, probably late morning, when they attempted to access the accounts that their client had likely referenced in the prenatal leave documentation. I had not timed it to coincide with the birth. The timing was simply what the 48-hour processing window produced. Sylvia paused at the door on her way out. "Would you like me to let you know when she's delivered?" she asked. Her voice was careful, professional, but with the particular care she used when she was asking something that existed at the boundary between information and intrusion. I considered it for a moment. "No," I said. "If there are any medical complications, anything that affects the child's health, let me know immediately. Otherwise," I shook my head once. "No." Sylvia nodded and left. I stood and walked to the window. 47 floors below Chicago was conducting itself under 11 inches of snow, with the particular stoicism of a city that has never once considered moving somewhere warmer. The streets were white. The cars moved slowly, their headlights catching the last of the morning's snowfall. The lake was somewhere beyond the visible edge of things present but unseen, doing whatever it does in December when no one is watching. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a hospital room at Northwestern Memorial, a child was being born into a situation it had not created and could not control. It was arriving into a story that had been written around it by people who had used it as a means to various ends, none of them its own. I had done what I could. The discretionary trust was structured and funded. The administrator was independent. The resources were there, education and medical. The basic material stability that a child should not have to wonder about. Sabrina would never know where it came from. The child would grow up without knowing either. And that was the appropriate outcome. Some forms of care are not diminished by being anonymous. They are made cleaner by it. I thought about Edmund's question from the night before. What are you going to do about the child? And I thought about my answer, and I thought about whether it was enough. There is no answer to that question that feels sufficient. You do what you can. You build what you can build from where you are standing, and then you let the child have its own life, which is the only thing any of us can ultimately give each other the space to become something that wasn't predetermined by someone else's decisions. I hoped standing at that window that Sabrina would love that child the way it deserved to be loved. Whatever she had done to me, whatever calculations had governed the past 18 months, children do not inherit the moral weight of their parents' choices. They arrive clean. The least any of us can do is try not to change that. There are hopes too fundamental to abandon even when everything else has ended. My phone rang at 10:32. Conrad. Rafferty's voice was different from its usual register, not excited, which would have been unlike him, but resolved. The voice of a man delivering the last sentence of a long document. Broderick was arrested 40 minutes ago at O'Hare. He was attempting to board a flight to Frankfurt. And I was quiet for a moment. Has Rosalind been notified? She was the one who notified the agents about the flight. I absorbed that. Rosalind Reeves, who had received an anonymous package on a Wednesday afternoon and had been on the phone with her attorneys within the hour, who had filed with the SEC and the FBI using her own independently compiled materials, who had frozen the accounts, engaged the firm, and apparently tracked her husband's travel itinerary well enough to contact federal agents before he cleared security at O'Hare. She had performed a surgery. From the first cut to the last, she had not missed a single step. "Rafferty," I said. "Sir." "It's done." A brief pause. "Yes, sir, it's done." I thanked him and ended the call. I set the phone on the desk and stood at the window for another minute, looking at the city below, the slow-moving cars, the white streets, the muffled ordinary machinery of a Thursday morning, proceeding without knowledge of or particular interest in what had just concluded. Everything was over. I had known intellectually that it would feel like this, not triumphant, not relieved, just quiet. The particular quiet of a completed thing, a game that has reached its final position, a board that no longer requires any moves. What I had not anticipated, what surprised me standing at that window in the early morning of a December Thursday, was the space that opened behind the quiet. It was over, which meant something else was now possible. I just didn't know yet what it was. 3 months passed. Chicago moved from December into March, from buried under snow to something that hesitated at the edge of thaw. The lake was the first indicator, the way it always was. The solid gray of midwinter giving way at the shoreline, the ice fracturing in long, dark lines, the water beneath beginning to show through. I read the news the way anyone reads news about people they once knew, with distance, with the sensation of watching something happen to someone else's life. Except that it had been mine, for a while. The Chicago Tribune ran a long piece on the Broderick Reeves case in late January. I read it at my desk on the 47th floor, with coffee before Sylvia arrived. The sentencing had taken place in federal court on January 31st. 9 years tax evasion wire, fraud money laundering. The judge cited the complexity of the scheme and the deliberate use of international shell structures. Reeves' capital had been placed into liquidation 3 weeks after the arrest. The assets were gone. Rosalind had filed for divorce the day after he was taken into custody and finalized everything in 6 weeks. She gave no public statement. She did not attend the sentencing. The Tribune quoted a legal analyst, a textbook example of institutional arrogance meeting institutional accountability. Oh, I thought that was accurate enough. Preston had entered a guilty plea in late January. 4 years forgery conspiracy to commit fraud accessory to the Reeves capital offenses. The Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission moved immediately. His law license was revoked, not suspended. Revoked. He would not be eligible for reinstatement. I had sat with that for a while, not because it surprised me, because it was final, in a way the arrest had not been. There is always until the very last moment a part of the mind that holds space for a different outcome. The revocation was the last door closing. No version of this ended differently now. Whitfield's clinic on North Michigan Avenue had shut in January, doors locked on a Thursday morning, no notice to staff or patients. 3 civil lawsuits had been filed by former patients alleging undisclosed genetic substitution in their procedures. The investigation was ongoing. Harmon's license had been permanently revoked in December. He was cooperating with federal investigators. It would not help him. Sabrina was living in a rented apartment in Wicker Park, working part-time at a small real estate firm. The Lincoln Park house was in the trust's possession. The accounts had been transferred. The baby was a boy. Born healthy, 3 weeks early on the December morning, I had sat at my desk and signed 2 envelopes and watched the snow. Rafferty's February report included one additional item, delivered without editorial comment. Remy Callahan had been notified of his potential paternity through an anonymous intermediary. He was consulting a family law attorney about his rights under the Illinois Parentage Act. I had not arranged that notification, but I had not prevented it either. The child deserved to know who his father was. Whatever kind of man Remy turned out to be, he deserved the chance to find out. Some things are not mine to control. They only need to be left undisturbed. I folded the Tribune piece and set it beside my coffee. I looked out at Lake Michigan. The ice was breaking up long fracture lines along the shoreline, the dark water showing through in widening gaps. March in Chicago is not spring, but it is the beginning of the argument for it. People often ask what revenge feels like. The honest answer is that it does not feel like anything in particular. Not triumph, not joy. It feels like the moment after a very long storm, not the dramatic stillness of the eye, but the quiet that arrives when the whole thing is finally over and the sky begins slowly to clear. You look at what remains. You find that the landscape has changed, and you find that you are still standing in it and that your next step is entirely your own to choose. For the first time in a long time, I could hear myself think. Not about them, about something further ahead. About the space that had opened the morning, Rafferty said it's done, and something that had been holding its breath for 18 months finally exhaled. My phone rang. Edmund. Hey, he said. You doing all right? I looked at the lake. The fracture lines had widened since morning. The dark water beneath was moving, remembering slowly what it was. I think I'm starting to be. A pause, then good. Just that. It was exactly the right amount of words. Spring came to Chicago, the way it always does, gradually then, all at once. By May, Lake Michigan had shed its ice entirely, and the city carried the energy it gets in the first warm weeks of the year, as though it cannot quite believe it survived another winter. I stood at the window on the 47th floor on a Tuesday morning and felt for the first time in a very long time genuinely present in the room I was standing in. Not managing it, not performing for it, just there. The press briefing was small. 8 journalists. A conference room on the 44th floor. No prepared remarks beyond a single page Sylvia had drafted. She stopped me in the corridor before I walked in. "Are you certain this changes everything about how you operate?" I looked at her 11 years, the woman who had taken French calls at 6 a.m., and set down 2 sealed envelopes on a December morning without being asked to explain why. "That's the point," I said. She held my gaze for 1 second, then she stepped aside. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. I answered every question directly, including the one about why the founder had remained anonymous for 3 decades. The honest answer. I had believed that keeping myself small kept me safe. I had been wrong about what I was keeping myself safe from. The story ran in the Tribune's business section the following Thursday. Accurate, not particularly dramatic. Exactly what I wanted. Afterward, I sat at my desk and looked out at the lake, the same view I had managed from behind glass for months. The smell of the city came through the gap at the window's edge, and I left it open. Edmund had suggested a neighborhood Italian on Armitage Avenue. No tasting menus, no choreographed courses, bread that arrived warm without being asked for. "The secret is out," he said somewhere between the first glass and the second. "How does it feel?" Like taking off a coat I'd been wearing so long I'd forgotten it was there. He turned his glass slowly. "Was it worth it? The 30 years? Parts of it," I said. "The original instinct, yes, but somewhere along the way it stopped being strategy and became habit. And then something else." I set down my glass. I told myself I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had. That was true partly. The fuller truth is, I was afraid. So I showed people the smaller version, the safer one. A pause. I thought that was wisdom. It turns out it was just another kind of running away. Edmund smiled, the real one, unchanged in 30 years. "Your father would argue with you about that." "He'd be wrong," I said, "but he'd argue well." We walked the lakefront after dinner. At some point I said, "You know what I keep thinking about Sabrina's son? Nearly 5 months old. He doesn't know any of this exists. His whole world is whether he's warm, whether he's fed, whether someone holds him when he cries." I watched the light on the water. Somewhere between 11 and 57. I forgot how to ask those questions. Edmund said, "Are you asking them now?" "I'm starting to," I said. Back at the apartment that night, a message from Sylvia. A development group in Copenhagen logistics project multi-year scope. They had read the Tribune piece. I replied in 4 sentences. Next month, I'd be available. I closed the laptop. I went to the window. The lake was dark and still city lights reflecting in long, unbroken lines toward the horizon. I stood there for a while, not thinking about Copenhagen, not thinking about anything, just looking at the water, just being there. On a Saturday morning at the end of May, I made my own coffee, opened the windows of the Streeterville apartment for the first time since October, and sat down to finish telling you this story. The lake outside was flat and blue. The city had the particular quality it gets on weekend mornings, unhurried, generous in no particular direction. I sat in the armchair by the window, my father's chair, the one I had carried from Lincoln Park, and listened to Chicago, simply going about the business of being alive. I had called my parents the previous evening. I talked for a long time. Somewhere in the middle of it, I told my mother everything, not the strategy, not the legal structure, but the human part. What it felt like to sit at a dinner table and understand in real time the shape of what had been done. What it felt like to cry alone in December. What it felt like to place a photograph face down on a desk and leave it there. She cried quietly without making it about herself. My father came on the line when she finished. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Your grandfather used to say a man finds himself in the moments when he has every reason to become something worse. I'm proud of you, son. Some things need a moment before they can be received properly." I had been thinking in the weeks since the press briefing about the real lesson, not the one about financial structures or legal strategy. Those had their own logic, and the logic had worked, and I would not pretend otherwise. But they were not the lesson. I had spent 30 years telling myself that I kept my life small for wisdom. What I understand now is that it was fear. The quiet kind, the kind that organizes your life around a threat so familiar, you stop seeing it as a threat and start experiencing it as simply the way things are. I had wanted to be loved for who I was not, what I had. That was true. But the fuller truth was that I had never fully allowed anyone to see who I was in the first place. I offered a curated version, careful, capable, steady, and called it honesty. It was not dishonesty, but it was a particular kind of loneliness dressed up as self-protection. I walked along the lakefront before meeting Edmund. Chicago, in late May at 8 in the morning, is one of the most ordinary and most beautiful things I know. I walked without purpose, not managing, not calculating, just walking. I thought about Sabrina's son, nearly 5 months old now, growing without awareness of any of it. I hoped he was warm. I hoped someone held him when he cried. Not complicated hopes, just the ones that remain when everything else is set aside. I thought about Remy Callahan, 29, learning he might be a father. I hoped he would find the boy. I hoped the world would be kinder to both of them than the people who had brought them into this story had been. Sometimes a hope placed carefully and without expectation is the most honest form of involvement available. Edmund was already at the coffee shop on North Clark when I arrived, a small place with no ambition beyond being exactly what it was. He had ordered for both of us, 30 years of the same coffee in each other's company. We sat by the window. We talked about nothing important for a while, which was its own kind of important. At some point I looked out at the lake and thought about my father, the wooden chessboard, the 5 languages. Given one by one with patience and the understanding that the world reveals itself differently depending on how you ask it questions. But there was a language he had not taught me. The language of knowing when to stop hiding, of standing in a room as the fullest version of yourself and trusting that the version is enough. Not performing capability or steadiness or quiet competence as a substitute for the real thing. Just enough as you are, without the coat. I was 57. I spoke 5 languages. I had spent 30 years becoming very good at being unseen, and 6 months becoming willing to be seen. Late, I thought, but not never. I set down my cup and looked at Edmund. "Do you want to walk?" He nodded the way he nodded when the answer was obvious and words were beside the point. We stood. We pushed open the door and stepped out into the Chicago May morning sun, warm on the sidewalk, the lake running blue to our left, the city stretching ahead with no particular agenda and no end in sight. I did not think about what came next. I just walked. That morning, that lake, that city, that friend. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the end exactly what everything had been for. If there is one thing this family story taught me, it is that silence is not the same as strength. I spent 30 years keeping the windows closed, protecting a smaller version of myself and calling it wisdom. What I was protecting in the end was fear. This was my family betrayal, my particular version of it. And I believe, as someone who has sat alone in a dark apartment at 11 o'clock on a December night with nothing left to hold on to, that God does not waste pain. Every fracture in this family story brought me to the only place I had never allowed myself to stand fully present, fully honest, fully myself. My advice, if you'll take it from someone who learned it the hard way, don't do what I did. Don't offer the world a smaller version of yourself and call it caution. The people worth keeping won't love you less for being whole. Family betrayal does not have to be the end of a family story. Sometimes it is the beginning of an honest one. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the surface. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment with the city you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very last word.